This time we'll dismiss the kids to go to Kids Corner. You know, I meant to do this the last couple of weeks, and it slipped. At Christmas, we always help some small church pastor. One of the ones this year is a young man named Ryan, who is just 24 years old. He started pastoring a little church out of college, and it's a little wide spot in the road. There's not many people there, and they don't pay him much. And he's getting married this summer, which is why he's on the list. And he sent us this wonderful thank you note, that says, I've been at this church for just over 2 years and will be married in May, but thank you so much for this generous gift and supporting me this season. It means the world. May God bless you and your church family, amongst other things. I wanted to share that with you. We get these back. We're not forgotten about it, so I wanted to read this. Let me say something about this sermon. We're in the middle of a cultural clarity. In some ways, this will be a difficult sermon. That might not be the right word. There will be parts of the sermon that might sound political, but that's not what drives this. I want to make actually a very important biblical and theological point. Here's what often happens. We uphold a biblical principle where most of culture pales in comparison. And that is the case today. Plus, we are living in a time where wisdom is just found in short supply and is routinely ignored. And I always hear in a week, hey, this is not the way it is anymore. We have this new way of thinking. This is what modern people think. And some of us who are used to old things like Gnosticism going, no, that's not that new. This is a 2,000-year-old retread. We've been down this road before. This is quite old, actually. And all the stuff that's new, we've been down this way. We've been tried many, many times. And I can tell you how it's going to end. So we live in this time with very little wisdom. We should not ignore the trends of culture. I think it's not enough to just ignore it. We should throw it down, bury it, and then salt the earth over top of it, so nothing grows there again. And this is one of those places. And it's my contention that in this potential way, we've really lost our way. When I came in, I put my slides in, and Libby said, are there any typos here? Are you sure you're supposed to be diversity versus diversity? I go, no, that's what I meant to have in there. Because kind of these competing visions that we have. I want to read out of Galatians chapter 3, starting in verse 25, going down to verse 29. Paul writing and saying, now that faith has come, we are no longer under a guardian. So in Christ Jesus, you are all children of God through faith. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise. Here's how we've lost our way. It's not that long ago, depending on how you judge time, you can go back 70 years, 80 years. There used to be things that dominated parts of our culture in one way or the other. And so some places in the country would have two different school systems. They were supposed to be separate but equal, and what they actually got was separate but not very equal. And so you lived in a world not here, but in some places where you had white lunch counters and black lunch counters. You had white drinking fountains and black drinking fountains. You had white businesses and black businesses. Just the other night this week, I was flipping through and there was a movie on. Some of you have seen it, a movie called Green Book. And Green Book is a book that had, and if you were African American, and you were traveling across the country, especially maybe through the South, you had a book of the restaurants and hotels and places where you were welcomed. So you knew where to go and where not to go. And so some of us, there's probably even a few here that remember, let's go back 70 years. there was some music bubbling up from underneath the surface. And of course, certain people weren't supposed to listen to that music because that music had an ethnicity attached to it. It's that kind of music. And so we didn't listen to it at all. And then all of a sudden, we had people that became famous. Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, who started doing a lot of, or sometimes stolen, tunes from that genre and became very well known. Even people some of you really, really like, even though I think they're overrated, the Beatles got famous doing some of that music. They were performing what some people called black music. There's a lot of ways we've come so far. And all of a sudden, people started welcoming the inclusion of different influences in the culture. Then it was kind of, go through the 60s and 70s, it was all kind of different genres and influences were starting to combine. You get a little Caribbean in there, and you get some different things I could go through. And now we have restaurants you go to. Yes, we have French cuisine and Indian cuisine and all this stuff. And now you'll go into these, you'll go, this is a French-Indian fusion restaurant. And you go, wait a minute, how you have this with this, and you combine them and take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and you get a wonderful result. Some of the time. Somewhere in the last 10 to 15 years, something took a really bad turn. I was seeing this week that there are people who would like, some of you remember from the 70s, the TV show Kung Fu with David Carradine. They want it banned because David Carradine is not Asian enough. And maybe closer to some of your hearts, they want I Dream of Jeannie canceled because she's not Arab enough. I know what you're wondering. Why is this girl up here, this picture? This girl is named, I don't know how to pronounce it, Kezia. That's her name. And last name Dom, D-A-U-M, Kezia Dom or Keziah Dom. She's from Salt Lake City, Utah. This is about 2 years ago. She was a high school senior. This is a picture of her senior year. The dress she's wearing. Now, I've seen a couple different articles. One article says she bought the dress. I've read another article that says she made the dress. So I don't know which one, but that's her dress. And she wanted to wear it to prom. And she loved the color. And so one of the reasons why she liked it is she thought it had a nice high neckline. She wanted something to be a little, proper and modest and all this kind of stuff. And she loved the material. And she got herself all, looking nice and put the dress on and took her picture and put that picture on social media. This is my prom dress. Where she was trashed. Because that's an Asian fabric. And you can't be wearing one of those. I read there's a chef in Chicago. I know some of you will be familiar with him, Rick Bayless. And he has this very highly regarded restaurant, which largely, I think, and this is not my world, and I'm sure Tim and Libby can correct me later. It's kind of a Mexican. That's his base, but he adds other influences with it and creates all these dishes. You got to order, you got to make reservations way in advance, and it's really popular, and you got to put on a waiting list. And he's been protested recently because how dare he open up that kind of restaurant because he is not the ethnicity of the food he's making. All right. Now, why am I putting that? Because I am, of all my influences, I'm a majority Scottish, all of you who are wearing plaid today better not fail the blood test on the way out of here. We are now once again entering a world where George Wallace would be very comfortable, if you remember him from 1972, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. But we're doing it in a weird way, voluntarily, almost enforced from a different angle. And we're segregating along every possible line. Racial, ethnic, gender, and don't get me started down that road. All 57 of them, age, etc. And so each group has their thing. Our music, our pattern, our food, our clothing, our whatever. And if your group is not our group, you shouldn't do, say, sing, wear, enjoy the thing that we enjoy. Doesn't make much sense to me. That is not the picture we see in the New Testament. But it's also strangely, here is what we do see in our culture right now. Our culture is this: we are being forced into our tribes. And our tribes are being kind of held as important. We're squeezed into boxes that are getting narrower and narrower and narrower. And each box not only contains those people, but the stuff that someone has determined that only those people should have. And we're even being told that the value of a person is determined by whatever box they are in. In fact, if you can check off a lot of boxes, then your value goes up based on how many discounted boxes you can check. There's a name and all that. I won't bore you. So the first thing we must do is we got to walk in and we have to see what group you belong to and recognize you for the value of the group that you belong to and judge you accordingly. Because the value of any person is relegated to your group membership or the number of your group memberships. This is literally what's happening today. Now, I got an update this week. I saw what happened. I got an update from Ancestry.com. Every so often, their data gets massaged and updated a little bit. So I want to show you, this all started about 5 years ago, 6 years ago. I did Ancestry.com because unlike my wife is very, it's easy. My wife is half German, half Italian. But even her German half looks Italian. So she looks 100% Italian because the German half looked pretty Italian. My thing is, I think her German half is probably actually Italian, but got drug off by the Prussians in some European war 200 years ago. But I think that's what happened. But so my kids always knew what she was. And the pictures of her family look like the cast pictures from The Godfather. And my wife will go through names. Oh, that's the Portobellos. That's the Scaniccios. That's the Cimbalos. It's literally, it's like The Godfather. I was looking for Genco olive oil above the pictures, but I didn't see any. And so with me, no one knew because I'm adopted. So I did the whole thing, and it keeps getting updated. So as of today, and see what we kind of think is, if you got like, if your mom's half Irish, if your mom's Irish and your dad's Polish, you're not 50-50. That's kind of what you say. It all depends on which chromosomes from each one. You could be 80-20, 60-40, 70-30. Here is my mix as of today, unless the data gets changed in the future weeks. I am 53% Scot-Irish. The same people inhabited both those islands. So I'm 53% Scotch-Irish, 30% English, 8% Norwegian, 4% Swedish, 2% Russian, and 2% German. And I know what you're saying, Pastor, that adds up to 99%. You're right, I'm 1% West African. I don't know how that happened. There you go. That's my mix. So it turns out, in some general thing, then my kids get to be a quarter German, a quarter Italian, a quarter Scottish, and then the other quarter is English, Norwegian, Swedish, and little trace elements of Russian and German. There you go. Plus, I own a minivan. I am competing for the whitest guy in America. And we live in a time when the prevailing culture thinks that any of these percentages is determinative about anything. And so now we have our model, and we sit at our ethnic, regional, class, racial tables. And the leader yells to ensure that our table is allowed into the room. And the model is we have the big room and our table needs to go into the room. So we have all the tables with all our little groups all there in the big room. Because we have become defined by our region, by our class, by our ethnicity, and a host of other things. And this, we are told, is inclusion and diversity. I disagree. Let me tell you about things that are vastly more important than about melanin content and ethnicity and whether I'm Scottish or German or whatever I am. I grew up in a single mother home. I grew up in a factory town. I grew up with a wonderful grandmother right next door. I grew up with a grandfather a couple miles away. Every Sunday, we were at church. I had people there who knew me by name and asked me how I was doing and loved me. I met a girl named Michelle at college. I had people that sacrificially gave so I could have scholarships for that college. And then, a number of years ago, there's a man named Jesus who died and rose again. Everything I just mentioned is vastly more important to my life than anything I mentioned previously, and had much more influence. We are all overlapping circles, and there are hundreds of influences. There are values, there are economics, there are regions of what your parents did, there's education, there's all this stuff. And among those things are some of the things I talked about previously. There are billions of possible combinations with how these circles overlap. Almost so many that you could almost say each person's an individual. So I'm using this illustration purposefully. Let me tell you the biblical approach to diversity. And I'm using it because this is literally the first issue that arose in the life of the early church. Why I read Galatians chapter 3. The Jewish people were and still are remarkably resilient. Think about it for a second. They had been through Egypt 400 years. They wandered in the wilderness. They tried to start a country. Everybody around them didn't like them. Everybody around them attacked them. They got hauled off to Babylon. They came back. They tried to rebuild the temple. Then came Rome. And we won't even talk about in our lifetime where someone literally tried to exterminate all of them. Their traditions and practices sustained them through persecution and hardship. And one of those was food restrictions. No pork, no shellfish, no bacon double cheeseburgers, the sandwich that violates 2 food laws with 1 sandwich, and all the other things. And it also prohibited them from sitting at the same table as Gentiles. We have a little bit of that in our culture. Around my hometown in Marion, Ohio, is quite a hefty Amish population. And they're not zoo exhibits in my hometown. We don't all go to watch them. We just know they're there. And they farm. And if you're a child, you grew up in an Amish house, and you go out and you decide that I don't want to be Amish anymore, and you leave the Amish life and maybe get married, and you marry a Methodist girl, and you get a car and you get a job, and you go back to the Amish house, you might have a meal with them, but they'll actually bring another table in and set it adjacent so you would actually be at a different table than the rest of the family. It might be all around the square, but it'll be a different table. And so here in the early church, here was this issue. We now have Jewish believers and we have Gentile believers. We also had Greek believers and Roman believers. We had devout believers and ex-pagans and everybody in between. In Galatia, the first response was yes, they're allowed in. Sure, they're allowed in. Yes, they can be a part. But they have to avoid all the Jewish foods. They can't eat pork. They can't eat shellfish. They have to do all these things. And if they won't, then we won't sit at the same table as them. And in walked Paul. Now, here's the debate. I don't know exactly what Paul did. I don't know if Paul threw out the extra table and goes, no, we're all going to sit here. Or if Paul said, pass the pulled pork. And some of the Kansas City sauce, too. There's a debate on which one of those happened. But really what he said was, Paul said, hold on a minute. If you admit that Christ died for the whole world, and then see them as a different group than you, then you have no part in this thing called Christianity. If you want to make them sit at a different table, or view them as different, or view them as less than, or view them as their group and you're part of your group, then you have no part of this. For in Christ there's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female. Inclusion, biblically, New Testament, is not recognizing their table and saying, glad your table's in here next to our table. It's this picture. One great big table where there's room for everyone. On the same basis, on the same level, the same honored places. No one gets less than. I remember growing up, the McCorder family stuff was always bigger than the Ward family stuff. And when the McCorder family stuff happened, there's people around the dining room, and then the cousins were around the card tables, shoved together. Some of you have been there. And then you'd sit there, and then as the older family members would depart, the oldest cousins got moved to the big table. And so Thanksgiving, you'd sit there and go, wow, I'm just 2 from the big table. Who looks sick this Thanksgiving? You had that thought too growing up. It's a very big trend right now that your value is determined by whatever group you're in. As long as my sign, as long as my identity, big word right now, is in a color, is in a class, is in an ethnicity, is in a subgroup, then we cannot all sit at God's table. If my sign says Scottish, then I have to go to the table with the plaid tablecloth. No chuckles? I thought that was pretty good. But if my sign says Jesus Christ, then we all sit at the same table. Maybe, I don't know, perhaps my view is stained, and I'll admit that. Probably because until literally 5 years ago, I had no idea of my ethnic heritage or anything else. I think it's not a secret that was probably somewhere in the northern half of Europe, but I had no idea. I grew up in a small Midwestern town. I'd never heard of Italian beef. I couldn't identify rigatoni or ziti if you waved it in front of me. I had no idea what on earth a gyro was, let alone how to pronounce it properly. Or a host of other things. I've said before, I was at Olivet going through the food line. This is the first time in my life I saw a chicken sandwich that had a patty in it. And I didn't know what it was. I now know my DNA. I now know the breakdown and what the percentages is. But there's no pull there. I don't need to go find my tartan in Edinburgh. And there's plenty of shops I can do that. There's no pull there. Because my identity's not there. And I feel kind of thankful that my identity's not there. My identity today is with Christ and in Him crucified. I don't want to sit at the table with the plaid tablecloth. It might be nice. I don't want to sit at any table other than the Lord's table. It's always a joy when you find someone else from that table. Friday morning, I found myself in a place that I didn't think I'd ever end up. I was at the United Center in Chicago, where for my granddaughter's birthday, my son had bought her 2 tickets to Disney on Ice, and he was going to take her. But there was a death in Dottie's family, and so they drove back to Pittsburgh to attend a funeral, and Adam had called early in the week and said, Dad, here's the deal. If we go, can you take Mabel to Disney on Ice at the United Center? And I breathed deep. Yes. You haven't lived until you've heard 3,000 girls from ages 3 through 5 sing Let It Go at the top of their lungs. There was a mom sitting next to us with about a 3-year-old, and Mabel and the 3-year-old girl were interacting a little bit, and there was about a 10-minute intermission between the Frozen portion of Disney on Ice and the Encanto portion of Disney on Ice. And she was trying to get a picture of her daughter with the ice in the background. They had quite elaborate setup. And I said, excuse me, would you like me to take your picture with your daughter? And she goes, oh, that'd be nice. And I jumped up a row and got them together and took their picture. And she said, oh, where are you from? And I answered, and I said, how about you? She goes, oh, we live just south of Evanston in a neighborhood in the city. And I went, well, my granddaughter lived in that neighborhood, and she was born in Rogers Park. Oh, really? Oh, well, we live in Rogers Park. My husband is he's on staff at a church in Rogers Park. And I went, oh, which one? And she goes, oh, Park Community Church in Rogers Park. And I went, my son and daughter-in-law went to that church when they were at Rogers Park. And she looked at me funny, and then she looked at Mabel, and she said, are you Adam's dad? 9.5 million people in the city around Chicago. You go to that and you run into someone who's actually friends with your daughter-in-law. And so now a bunch of pictures were taken with this girl and Mabel and sent everywhere. And it was, what started it, the little girl's name was Grace. And I said, oh, we like Grace. We have a niece that's named Grace. It was a name that my wife and I bantered around a bit, for our daughter and all that kind of thing. We like that name. And she goes, oh, you must be a Christian then. And that's what started everything. When you have full inclusion, you don't have the barriers that keep us apart in this world. Right now, we want everybody to be forced into their little tribes and getting all their value and identity there. That's not the picture. I don't want to sit at my table and have to look across at someone else. I want to all sit around the big table. I think it's an idea that we've lost a little bit today. I like the biblical idea of inclusion a little better than the one that we're getting today.